We'll go ahead and get started because I know we only have an hour together, and I want to respect everybody's time, but I'm really grateful that you're all here. Welcome back to the Be Better Club. I wanted to first note that we've had several events this semester already, and those are now up on our center's YouTube channel and our website. So you can see our previous Ethically Speaking event, which was on engineering and emotion that took place yesterday, and you can see the last Be Better Club session that we did too. So you can review things if you miss them. Even this discussion, folks can catch later on if they want. So um, this semester in Madison, you're new. I know Sable and Josh, you've heard me say this before, but this semester we're focused on environmental and agricultural ethics issues. Partly that's in loose collaboration with the Association of Practical and Professional Ethics. So we're focusing on those. We did a session on de-extinction, talking about direwolves last time, and we're shifting a little bit to something more local today to talk about the Florida manatee issue, and in the context of agriculture and environmental ethics. Hey, Jillian.
Hi, how are you?
Good. It's so good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
I was just saying we're going to talk today about the case of the Florida manatee and talk about the tensions between agriculture and wildlife. And I'd given us a podcast to sort of frame that discussion, which you may or may not have had a chance to listen to. But that was a discussion about the Indian River Lagoon, which I know Josh and Sable, you both know pretty well. But Jillian and Madison, do you both know that context of the Indian River Lagoon? Sable, you've probably been in Florida longer than I have. Do you know that story well enough to talk it through?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? My connection isn't too good over here.
No worries. I was just asking if you knew enough about the Indian River Lagoon saga to talk us through that, or if you want me to do it.
Well, I know a bit about it. Mm, I guess it depends what specifically, but yeah, there has been a lot of issues with pollution from fertilizer, which was one of the main things it talked about in the podcast, was how that is affecting the seagrass that the manatees eat. But yeah, that has been a problem there for a while.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's what got me thinking about this case. And the Indian River Lagoon is this really complicated ecosystem off our Atlantic coast here, that has tensions around seagrass growth and agricultural runoff, but other forms of pollutants as well. And there's tensions there because it's a big place for manatees. And the state has for a long time now been thinking that through epistemically, thinking that through scientifically, and also thinking that through ethically, like what's the best practice, what ought we to do about potential pollutants in the Indian River Lagoon. And this podcast was about manatees. So the second question is, do you all know the story of the manatees? Josh, did you get to see, you saw manatees?
Yeah, I did. I saw them. I don't know if it was Indian River. It's just north of Orlando at there's in the winter grounds. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Probably maybe Blue Springs.
Blue Springs, yeah.
Yeah. So the manatees have been here forever. They're a Florida native species. They've been around for longer than people have in Florida. Well, our people in Florida. They're part of the native Florida ecosystem, but they're under threat. And they're a really interesting species because they need warm water to survive. And even in Florida, the water gets cold enough that they need heat sources. So they winter in our springs, which if I think you all know about our springs, but I'll say it anyway. Our springs pump out groundwater at a sort of more or less constant 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And so over the winter, the manatees take advantage of those and swim up into the springs to get out of the rivers, which get a lot colder, and obviously out of the salt water, which gets even colder. And so they overwinter in our springs, but they also have other heat sources, which I find really fascinating. And this podcast brought those up. The Canaveral power plant, which is out in the Indian River Lagoon, is a site for thousands of manatees to gather when the water gets colder. And that is because directly the result of the outflow from the power plant, which is warm water used to cool the power plant. Warm water is pumped out into the lagoon, and that warm water becomes a winter habitat for manatees. So there's this really interesting relationship between a native species and this relatively new heat source. And so there are tensions around, and those aren't the only ones, right? So the springs and the power plant, and then there are thermal basins out in the Atlantic that produce sources of warm water that are a little deeper. But the power plant is a really interesting connection because you've got this anthropogenic source of warm water and this native species, and there are real tensions there. The reason it's an important story in this environmental ethics context is because of the die-offs that have happened to manatees because of failures of seagrass growth. So their main food source has been goes through these cycles where it gets overridden by algae growth. And so algae as the resultant of pollutants, algae blooms happen, they deoxygenate, is that a word? Oxygenate? That's not a word. Deoxynize?
I feel like oxygenate is a word. Oxidize
Oxygenate.
would have a different meaning.
Oxidize would have a different meaning.
Yeah, but I think
was
like
I missing? I was missing a
oxygen-
syllable there, Gretchen, or something.
let me look it up.
Great. This is how we should do it. We should look it up. Oxygenate. Yeah, that's what we're doing. We're oxygenating. Anyway, the algae growth deoxygenates.
To combine, supply, or I don't know why they use this word, to impregnate with oxygen.
Well, there you go. There you go. That is
so yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
I know. Merriam-Webster.
Well, you know what? Dictionaries can only take us so far. Great. Yes. So algae blooms cut down on seagrass. That's all we're trying to say. And that has led, especially in 2018, and then again in 2021. So in these sort of cycles, there have been what was described in the podcast in a phrase I had not heard before coming from the Marine Mammal Protection Act as unusual mortality events, which just mean mass die-off of manatees. Because of starvation. Manatees face all kinds of threats, as I'm sure you know, from boating accidents to other sorts of collisions with human animals. But in this case, the mass die-offs come as an indirect result of human activity. And that is that nitrogen and phosphorus predominantly are leached into our waterways like the Indian River Lagoon. That leads to algae growth, that leads to seagrass destruction, that leads to die-off. So it's this indirect causal chain in which we are a very important part. And therefore, there are ethical implications to consider. And that's really what I wanted to talk about today, because I think it's easy to say things like, if only we had better farming practices, then there'd be more manatees or something. And I think it's a little more complicated than that. But that's something I think to talk through. So am I missing details that you all know about either manatees or the lagoon?
Something that I thought was interesting, I was just thinking about it's pretty often talk about save the manatees, and it's always about
Sable, I can't hear you very well.
Me neither.
Can you hear me now?
A little better, yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think it's interesting how they're like most of the media I've seen about protecting manatees has to do with like manatees and boat collisions and stuff. But I really have never heard before about manatee deaths due to starvation. So I thought it was interesting to learn that like there are more manatee deaths due to starvation probably than from boat collisions, but you only ever really hear about boat collisions, in my experience at least.
Yeah, Sable, that makes sense to me. And I think there's something important going on there. Let's call it ethically. The sorts of things we've talked about this in class, but the sorts of things that we're sensitive to are the things that are most proximate to us. So if there's a direct correlation, causal relationship between your boat propeller and a manatee, that's something that's very visible to the public and very visible to the boater and obviously to the manatee. But this is a much more indirect relationship around ag runoff, but it has a bigger effect, which is interesting. I think the other bit of like, I don't know, let's call it data, the factual information that I'll provide is that there have, especially in the Everglades area, but also up here in Central Florida, there have been really intentional regulatory moves to cut down on agricultural runoff. So I wrote down some data. Palm Beach County farmers here in Florida cut their nutrient runoff by 66% in 2022 and 63%. This is against like means. So 66% in 2022 and 63% in 2023, which is twice what was required by law.
That's
Um,
awesome.
yeah, it is awesome. That's what I was
That's my
thinking.
home county.
Ah, nice. Yeah, yeah.
Represent.
There you go. And here in Orange and Seminole County too, in 2024, there was a big push by local agricultural representatives against a Governor DeSantis ban. Okay, that's going to be too many words. In 2023, the governor banned local moratoria on fertilizer bans. Does that make sense? He banned bans.
Okay.
It's unclear to me exactly why. The reason given was that the state wanted to better study their effectiveness. So anyway, in 2024, the following year, my county and UCF's county, Orange and Seminole and Orange respectively, pushed back and really pushed for local control over those bans to better control ag off at the local level. And they argued it's effective. Look at Palm Beach County, right? So there's these tensions between who's in control of their local environment and why. But those two examples are examples for me of the ways in which farmers, let's call them broadly, farmers and ranchers, agricultural representatives, know what they're doing in the sense that they have facts about a problem that was indirectly their fault, right? Too much agricultural runoff, and they have partly because they're incentivized to because of the regulation, but they have pushed to cut down on those harms, those environmental harms. And there's all kinds of reasons we might ascribe to them for that move. It might just be they don't want to get fined by the state, but given that they're suppressing twice what they're legally required to in terms of runoff, there's probably something else normative going on that they think it's a good thing to cut down on runoff. So that's to sort of add a little data to complexify the initial claim that there's the correlation is between manatee deaths and just ag runoff. There's probably something else going on there too.
Well, as for
Yeah, Gretchen, go ahead.
yeah, as for manatee deaths, Palm Beach County would be really interesting because they don't have the freshwater spring system to sequester manatees in the wintertime. But manatees are obviously like very popular and beloved in Palm Beach County area, and the intercoastals are subject to a lot of harmful algal blooms. So it's interesting that we're talking about manatees in the context of the Indian River springs that we're talking about, but Palm Beach County was incentivized for probably a multitude of different reasons, and manatees were probably at the very bottom of that list, but they're characterized as something cute and lovable. And so for us environmentalists, we like to talk about them, but for the agriculturalists, I think that there were much more significant impacts that they were concerned about.
Interesting. Gretchen, if you have more, tell me more about the reasons Palm Beach County pushed to cut their runoff. Is that
So
just
I didn't know that statistic. Since I've been in Orange County for the past couple of years, I haven't really given a lot of attention to Palm Beach County. But what I do know is like in our area, we struggle with eutrophication a lot. We have a lot of infrastructure in place to basically just sequester excess runoff. Like every neighborhood has multiple ponds. We consider them lakes. They're stocked with fish, but they are horribly eutrophic. They're disgusting. When I came to Orlando, I didn't know that Florida could have clear water as lakes. I thought that was just a product of being swampland, and I just realized it's actually just a product of poor management of fertilizers. Yeah, they're horrible down there. And then the infrastructure built around waterways, specifically the intercoastal, really doesn't accommodate for runoff. So I don't know about the methods that they implemented, but I'm really interested to find out more about them because I never viewed Palm Beach County as really adaptive towards any environmental issues.
That's interesting. And I mean, I guess that resonates up here too, because almost everywhere there are, anywhere there's a development, there needs to be by law some retention pond, which is similarly atrophic, right? That's just covered in algae because it's capturing all this nutrient runoff.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes good
It's
sense.
funny because I'll hear a lot of like I don't want to like stereotype, but like older women in suburban neighborhoods complaining about it as their form of environmental activism without understanding that they're actually serving their intentional function to hold nutrients because it has to go somewhere. Because they're concerned about the birds that they're familiar with and the turtles that they love, and so it's funny that it's an opportunity to put people in the suburbs into a larger context that they may have not noticed.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It reminds me, my first job after my first degree was in North Carolina, and I remember reading local articles about drownings, regular drownings in pig lagoons. So North Carolina has huge swine production, and they similarly capture swine refuse in lagoons in order to prevent runoff. But the smell is so bad that workers regularly overcome and fall in and drown. And that's horrible. There's nothing
Yeah.
else to say about that, except it's an example again of sort of trying to mitigate the byproduct of agriculture by capturing it, by sequestering it. Now that's effective until one of those lagoons bursts or a storm comes in and floods it or whatever. But similar story, I guess, a little less gross here in Florida because it's not poo, but same sort of idea that we're capturing nutrient runoff and trying to sequester it. Jillian, go ahead. Sorry. You can always just interrupt too, Jillian, please.
No, you're good. You're good. So yeah, so I'm a moral psychologist and I do work with ethics education. I don't do a lot with environmental ethics at all. So that's part of the reason that I got on this call, was just to kind of hear more of the basics, like what environmental ethicists are saying about ethics. It seems to me so far that a lot of what we're talking about, the different directions that governments can go, there's a lot of trade-off. Because like you're saying, like the stuff has to go, the runoff has to go somewhere. So how do environmental ethicists see like the prioritization of manatees over fish and turtles over whatever? How do you make those decisions in order to like pass policies?
Yeah, I mean, I can offer an answer, but I hate to represent A, all of environmental philosophy or environmental ethics, or B, anything about agriculture and policy trade-offs. But I think you're right that every ethical decision in whatever applied domain you're working is about value tensions and trade-offs. And that's something we see in environmental ethics regularly too. So Gretchen hinted at it with manatees that, in Palm Beach County, there's not a direct relationship because there are no springs between runoff and manatees, but manatees end up being a focus because they're cute. It's the charismatic megafauna issue, right? A lot of policy is directed around, and I think this should resonate as a moral psychologist, right? Is directed around what sort of intuitions we can tap into in the voting bodies or the regulatory bodies. So if we say to our lawmakers, you got to stop ag runoff because look at how amazing manatees are, that's going to resonate differently than you've got to stop ag runoff because it's overwhelming our retention ponds and causing these like less interesting, that's not fair, less emotionally compelling ecological disasters, right? Water table issues and all the rest, right? So I think a lot of it is psychological in that sense, that when we're coming to policy making, we're trying to tap into intuitions. But the other thing to say, Jillian, is that I feel like so far we've talked about manatees and about lagoons, and we haven't really done any like work that I would consider to be environmental ethics work, because a lot of that work is conceptual. It's trying to define what we're trying to defend and why. So on the ag side, part of that is about the concept of husbandry, which a mentor of mine, Bernard Rollins, had leaned pretty heavily into in his accounting of in veterinary and agricultural ethics. But I remember him telling me that husbandry has, as a term, has Norse roots. Its roots are hus and bond, so living with. And the old idea of husbandry is that farmers used to literally live with their animals, right? They would raise animals, but use them as a heat source and in return, and a food product and whatever else. In return, they would care for those animals because there was this deep relationality, this deep intersectionality between them. So I think husbandry plays a really big role for our agricultural people to this day. So I think partly when we're talking about ag runoff, it's partly a defensive maneuver by farmers because they see some important, almost familial relationship between their livestock and or their land. Now, I don't have any data to support that on hand, but it would surprise me to meet a rancher or a farmer, whether that's of any kind, who doesn't care deeply. And so I think this idea of husbandry is one of these important concepts in agricultural ethics that I
So
wanted to
is
sort of.
the opposing argument to that along the lines of believing that animals or nature is like there to serve humans, like the purpose of animals is for, our consumption or our use, whatever?
Yeah, for sure. To stick with my like farmer rancher example, yeah, the other argument you might give is that yes, farmer and ranchers use the land and that is it, right? They just produce maximally what they can, they take maximally what they can. And we've got examples of that even in the US context. That's what led to the Dust Bowl era in the 30s and 40s in the West. And the Dust Bowl era then in turn is what led to Aldo Leopold and the land ethic and all of these other really well-known environmental positions that I can talk us through in a second. But yeah, it's either that farmers and ranchers use the land and or animals on the land merely as instruments for their profit, which is pretty dark, or that they use they have this value, this caring relationship. They treat them intrinsically, and of course, it's neither of those. It's something in the middle. And again, that's the value trade-off. There are lots of and I don't want to distract us with theory unnecessarily, but there are lots of theorists who have worked in this space too. We talked a little bit about Aldo Leopold, and I know Gretchen and Sable, you've heard this from me in course contexts. Um, but Leopold's land ethic is a really important component in environmental ethics. And Leopold, again, was writing in the 1940s, sort of coming out of the Dust Bowl, trying to think about relationships to the land. And his land ethic, I'll put this in the chat and also I'll read it to you, but the statement of his land ethic is that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and wrong when it tends otherwise. It's a very famous statement of the land ethic, and it's a really compelling idea. Leopold was deeply committed to his county in Wisconsin, which he had tried to fight back against soil erosion and degradation by replanting as a pine forest over his lifetime. But he was interested in these concepts that we know ecologically, integrity and stability, but coupled to this idea of beauty. And I've always found this really interesting because there's a subjectivity that's built in there. And I think this is true of conservation practices generally. We pick a state and we're like, that's the state we want to conserve, the state of the environment. It's not necessarily we're making a claim that that is the whatever most natural state or the state it should be. It's just that's the state that we tend to want to preserve. And for Leopold, that was a pine forest. And when pressed, he said, I like pines. It doesn't have to be pines, but he just liked pines. And so he brought this back not to like fields for ranchers like it was in the 20s, but instead all the way back to pine forests pre-ranchers. And he could have gone back further to some other sort of ecosystem, but pines. And this is a theme, I think, in ag and environmental ethics that continues to resonate. And I'm just going to keep talking, which is bad. So sorry, somebody had to say something, because otherwise I'm just going to like.
I was going to add to that, and to respond to, I don't have her name, and I'm on the web browser, the nice lady who's the psychologist.
Jillian.
I only have you, Dr. Bieber, as my picture, and I don't want to mess with anything, but
No
I think that like the answer to your question is about weighing what takes priority, is that there's never a unanimous decision, and that's part of our problem. But that's part of everybody's problem on any side of whatever debate there is, right? There's always a lot of diverse perspectives that come together and they try to reconcile at least one common truth to stand behind. But I was reading in a book for right now, actually, before this call, for my environmental politics class. The first premise of the book is that all environmental efforts, like for policymaking, are value-based, but they're under the illusion of being completely rational. And they are rational, right? But they're under the illusion of being science-based and critically informed, mathematically supported, when in actuality you're still using the same data to fight for your values, and the biggest conflict comes from two opposing values using the same data. So there is really no right answer. I think that ecologists have different perspectives than environmentalists would. I think ecologists try to weigh a bit more of a interdependent perspective like Aldo Leopold's, whereas many environmentalists would have much more of a sustainable development orientation, specifically considering human needs. There is consideration for other organisms, but I don't think it's the humans always take priority for environmental causes, which is why climate change is such a topic of conversation as opposed to these other issues. You know, agriculture has a huge climate impact. We talk about that a lot. Eutrophication, we're not swimming in those ponds, so it's not as popular of a conversation. But for ecologists or deep ecologists who have a deep philosophy around it, I think it's much more complex. I hope that it gives something interesting to think about.
Yeah, no, that is great. Thank you guys so much. So okay, the stuff that we have talked about with that trade-off, how are we applying that idea to the manatee situation? I live in Indiana too, so we don't have manatees here. So I'm just learning about all of this.
We have sea cows and you just have cows. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
yeah.
But you do have agriculture. You guys got corn.
Yeah. Jillian, I think it's a great question. And I think Gretchen's onto something with the distinction she's making between environmentalists and ecologists. Because I think one way to look at this is, why are we worried about manatees? There are two stories to tell here. One is the ecological story, that they play an important role in ecological niche, that they've been around for a long time. They're part of an ecosystem, and there's a duty to understand those relationships and preserve them, conserve them, understand them, whatever. There's a duty to the manatees and to their relations. And this is, as Gretchen described, I think a Leopoldian view, that there's something about the manatee as part of the land. And so the land ethic applies: integrity, stability, beauty. Like, this is part of the story we have to obtain. But more realistically, more pragmatically, the reasons we're worried about manatees in Florida are environmental or environmentalist, I think, to stick with your distinction, Gretchen. And of course, correct me if I'm wrong, but my instinct is that we preserve manatees because we like tourism dollars. We want to support the identity of the state of Florida, that is. And maybe there are like cultural and economic reasons more so than land ethical reasons. There's at least that.
Now, speaking of,
go ahead, Sable. Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm speaking about like that what we value more, like agriculture and manatees. Now, there are a lot of people who live right along the Indian River who have all like these mansions and stuff with a big lawn, and they want to put fertilizer on their lawn so that the grass grows greener. And from agriculture themselves and
Sable, we lost you again.
I'm sorry, out here. I was just saying that if these people who want to fertilize their lawns, should they be like valuing agriculture because they are only looking to like make their lawns look better?
Yeah, I mean, manatees are a symbol.
Yeah. Gretchen, I think do we lose Sable for a minute, or is it just me? Sable, I heard you say that here, I'll type it in the chat. We lost about 60% of what you said. We heard fertilizer on lawns. Sable, I really liked what you said about the other tension around manatees, which is, there's a push to protect them for some, like, let's call them tourist dollars or intrinsic reasons.
No, it sounded like it was robot Sable.
Can you hear me now?
A little bit. Yeah, we can hear you a little bit.
Yeah, well, basically, hopefully you can hear me this time. I tried connecting to the Wi-Fi again, but
Nope, Sable,
We've
we
lost
lost
you
you.
again.
Yeah.
I think it's like the background noise or something, but maybe it's also your mic. It's a little hard to tell.
Yeah. It does sound like it's a background noise problem. But I like the fertilizer on the lawns point from Sable. Like, there is that other tension that there are some people who just want nice looking lawns who live right next to the lagoon, let's say, and so they want fertilizer on their lawns. But for other reasons, the state regulators and environmentalists and whatever ecologists are saying, don't put fertilizer on your lawns for the manatees' sake. So again, there are these like multi-level value trade-offs. And so therein lies the tension, because I don't think it's the case the state doesn't care about manatees. I think they care a great deal, but there are lots of things they care about. And so this means that the manatees fall by the wayside. And Gretchen said something like this too in Palm Beach County, like manatees are on the list, but they're not high on the list of reasons why we want to like not pollute. So manatees are part of this ecological story, part of a value trade-off, but they're not very high on the list. And so they tend to lose out. And there are some groups like the ones you heard in the podcast that are actively trying to protect manatees, feed them during starvation events, care for them when they're sick and wounded. These are expensive propositions, and they're coming from a place of animal welfare. Not even necessarily species conservation, but people are worried about the individual harmed animals. And so there's that other tension, Jillian, that's at the heart of environmental science between species level concerns and individual welfare concerns. And that's the other really contentious part, I think, of environmental ethics and environmental philosophy. What's the target of our value practices? In biomedicine, for instance, and in psychology, it's individual participants and research or individual subjects. And in ecological sciences and environmental ethics, part of it is about species and the land and these bigger natural objects, all the way up to including rivers and lakes and mountains and things, which are also on that list.
Would you say that environmental ethics includes like some sense of, I don't know, like transcendent moral values, like almost spiritual? Like I'm thinking the way that indigenous communities might value their land or animals or something, doing sacrifices and stuff like that. Like that it's like there's the practical side where you're like, no, like animals are separate from humans, we just use them for our consumption. But then if you believe like there's an interconnectedness with you in the world, then you get more like environmentally conscious.
Yeah, for sure. It's not only that there's ecological science and empirical evidence behind that idea of interconnectedness, but yeah, there's this other parallel complementary tradition about, yeah, you described it as spiritual connections, and I think that's right. A lot of indigenous communities feel this way, but I think this is true of a lot of environmental ethicists as well. A great example of this is this guy, Holmes Ralston at Colorado State, who passed a few years ago. Ralston built a career around environmental ethics, talking about the power of awe and wonder. And his sense was that you can stand in front of a natural object like the Grand Canyon or a beautiful sunset, and you can feel something bigger than you. You can feel that sense of awe in the traditional sense. And that sort of emotional response for him was a spiritual connection to the something bigger than you, whatever we want to call that. And on the indigenous side, North American traditions and South American traditions especially have that sense. There are traditions that are deeply relational or deeply interdependent in those traditions. And that's led to legal implications. So we talked about in class, in my environmental ethics class, the Maori people in New Zealand fought to get a mountain that was sacred to their culture protected as a legal person. So this wasn't an argument about necessarily its ecological value, but more about its spiritual relationship to traditional peoples. And so that mountain now has legal standing, which is, you know, tangential to environmental ethics because it's in a legal context, but very much in line with what you're saying. This is a spiritual person that's now defended as a legal person, just like a corporation would be. And there are lots of examples of that happening now. Well, there are numerous examples of that happening now, of natural objects, rivers, mountains being granted legal personhood. So yeah, that I don't want to downplay the role of the spiritual in that sense either. Oh, Gretchen, you're muted, but you're saying something important, I can tell.
Oh, whoopsie, I forgot. I didn't want you to hear me chewing my lunch before. So I think that the argument of the spiritual is really compelling for some people. And it's underrepresented because of the facts and figures arguments that tend to take precedence. We think we can logic our way into good policy, but obviously like the current times don't really seem logical at all. So something like spiritual or value-based arguments have more of a place than I think a lot of environmentalists give credit for now. Maybe not environmentalists, maybe just scientists. You know, like they only get to represent their facts and figures, and they're not supposed to have an opinion because that's not objective. But in ecological systems, complexity theory, like I'm always talking about, there is an argument to be made for something like a mountain being an autonomous living creature of a sort. The definition of life becomes really hazy when you bring it down to like a chemistry or quantum physics level. The properties of emergence and life are really complicated and interesting. And you could use facts and figures to argue that the mountain has its own rights. But the spiritual is, I mean, the science and the spiritual almost go hand in hand, but the spiritual is much more sacred sounding. And I think that it's harder to argue against, which is probably why that works so well. But we live in a very secular world, so that's hard to unify.
Yeah, you know, I don't think we need to go like monotheistic when we're talking about the spiritual connection either, because I would say, you know, most of the farming families that I grew up in had, you know, they knew what they were doing. They were good farmers. Were they ecologists? You know, they weren't ecological scientists for sure, but they had this deep, awe-driven spiritual connection, let's just call it that, to their land and to their animals and to their culture. And I think a lot of farmers share this. And I think now you made me think, Gretchen, now of Wendell Berry. You all know Wendell Berry's work?
Yeah, Wendell Berry's great.
Yeah. So here's somebody, right? An excellent agrarian, an excellent farmer, but a practitioner, somebody who was like connected to the land. And it wasn't, you know, he was again an agrarian, a farmer. Was he an ecological scientist? No, right? He had this balance between the knowledge of the land and the spiritual connection to the land. And he was toying with this through his entire career and his entire writings. And I think really that's what draws so many of us to his writing, is that there's something else going on there. It's not a report of scientific data. It's a like an emotional connection to the place and the land. That's partly why I like Barry so much.
Can anyone hear me now?
Yeah,
Yeah. Hi, Fable.
Yeah, I'm back. I finally found the spot. I mean, I was just gonna say that I've noticed that a lot. I feel like a lot of like farmers and just people who enjoy living in nature often are a lot more connected to it than scientists. I feel like a lot of times scientists kind of like lose the bigger picture, and that just seems to be like I'm not really sure how to describe it, just kind of like the culture around science almost, or the idea that to be a scientist, you have to be like objective, only objective, and not really like emotionally connected with the land itself. That was actually one of the things that got me interested in like environmental science more broadly than just like biology or something, because I feel like there's more like room to like connect with the land itself and other people and how they value it.
I see
Yeah,
your
that
point, Sable. like as another student, I totally see where you're coming from, but it's unfortunate because biology is also supposed to be multi-scaled and it should be as integrated, but I just think it's more of a school system issue than the actual discipline itself that makes it not as holistic.
Oh yeah, I can see that.
You know, it'd be really interesting, and I'm sure somebody has done something like this, but it'd be really interesting to study you all, students in ecological and environmental sciences, and your experience as students when you're being trained, and then your experience in the field or in practice, and to sort of tease out those tensions between your sense of the field or your sense of the science.
That would be really cool.
I imagine a lot of ecological scientists end up, and I can see this in biology colleagues, like deeply committed to the species or the area they're studying in this way that's more than their job, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I guess that would make sense. You'd want your vocation to be your avocation too, or whatever that tension is.
That's the dream.
Yes, dream. Yeah.
I
Thanks, man.
always like to read. Bye. I like to read everybody's discussion posts on all my classes because it's like the one opportunity I have to hear other students' perspectives, especially because so many are online.
Yeah.
But that would be really interesting to have a study done on environmental students and their perspectives because so much, like I talked about in class earlier, is our education is trying to equip us for people who don't agree with us on basic principles. Whereas internally, there's also a lot of very conflicting perspectives. We saw it today talking about the debate with the Miami infrastructure. Some people were more concerned with gentrification. Some people were more concerned with ecology. So it would be interesting to see different students and their backgrounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always liked when I'm talking to other students who are studying environmental science or environmental studies, I always like to ask people like why they got interested in it and what specifically about environmental science makes them want to study it. I find it really interesting, like all the different perspectives that people have and different things that they specifically want to study. I mean, I know I'm biased because that's my major, so I talk to more students with that major, but I feel like I've noticed more variety than students of other majors that might be less interdisciplinary.
Yeah, I really like this moment in both biology and ecological science because things are getting so particular. We just know so much more detail and so much more complexity, and there's so many more niches in which to fall. And that's overwhelming and lovely at the same time. And it makes me hopeful for our connections to the natural world through those science, through that empirical knowledge.
I have another question about this.
Yeah, sure.
So you made a comment too about that spiritual connection to the land or animals. And you said something about like there's the science to support that too. I'm wondering what some of that support is. I guess in my head, like I did not grow up farm town. I grew up like very city girl. And so for me it's hard to understand that. Like I feel like I have some kind of bias block where I can't understand like I can just hear my parents being like, oh, you know, the hippy dippy shit, like environmental ethics, you know. So I'm trying to understand, like, I don't know, like what's some of the research that's been done on it?
Yeah.
Can I add something real quick to that?
Oh yeah, please.
I also agree. I struggle with it as well. As an environmentalist, I also am like, yeah, that's hippy dippy garbage sometimes, where I'm basically convincing myself that I'm standing on valid ground all the time. And so these debates become very like existential for me because all of a sudden any conservationist values I have are called into question. And I'm like, how valid am I really in the face of politics, urban development, or just like day-to-day conversations with somebody who disagrees with me. So I wanted to add that before I hear Dr. Beaver's response.
Glad I'm not the only one. Yeah.
No, I'm an environmentalist, and I also sometimes I'm like, these people are crazy.
Yeah.
Am I able to add one more thing too, real quick?
Yeah, of course.
Just gonna say that, like, for me personally, I grew up like I lived in a city area, but like going outside every single day. And even today, I feel like I need to go outside at least for a few minutes every day. It like refreshes me. It gives me energy. Almost. I feel like I don't know if I'd exactly call it spiritual, but I feel like I do have like a strong emotional connection just to nature, no matter how I feel whatever out and just for a few minutes every day. So to me, there is that like emotional connection. Maybe you could call it spiritual, maybe not, but yeah.
Yeah, this is great. I think that's such an important question. And like I'm trying to brainstorm all the different types of evidence that like one might offer. Um, the first thing to say is though, I think in ethics we often track shifts in value priority, right? It's not like anything was magically became valuable when it wasn't. It's just that it was a tension. I think the stuff that in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, my parents or my grandparents anyway would have called hippy dippy shit has become normative, right? Like, so I think there's a shift in value priority. So the hippy dippy has moved. Um, but they're still there. And there's some really interesting stuff on the psychology side. Jillian, you know, I'm sure you know that there's lots of evidence now of like nature connectedness theory. So there's a sense that people just feel better when intentionally connecting with nature. So there is some like psychological connectedness, and folks like E.O. Wilson and others have tried to ground this in evolutionary theory functionally, right? That nature connectedness is part of what we are biologically. Others have taken this to be purely cultural or indicative of the divorce, the mediation we have through our technologies. There's lots of theories around this, but nature connectedness is a real empirical phenomenon. Second, on the biology side, there's some really interesting work. I think it's really interesting work being done on um, non-charismatic species. We've talked a lot about cephalopods, octopus and squid, and empirical studies on their intelligence, but more than their intelligence, empirical studies on their capacity to connect, to relate to the researcher in an anthropological way, right? In a way that like becomes really close to anthropology. And that is an interesting like move in biology right now to study not cephalopods as a species, which we've done for a long time to understand like whatever cognition or whatever, but the individual organism and its relations. The other example of that is Suzanne Simard's work. If you know her work, she is a Canadian forestry biologist who came up with this hypothesis she called the mother tree hypothesis, where there's in every forest, I think the claim is something like, I'll paraphrase here, in every forest, there's a tree that is sort of in charge through its rhizomal network. And so it can communicate with others, and it is the mother tree of a forest. And that is more, for Samard and others, that is more than just like a anthropomorphizing analogy. That is a biological phenomenon. And it's only evidenced because somebody thought that it's more than an analogy, right? That there's something relational going on in forests because there's something more than mere accident about family relationships that can be read into forest.
Has there been any kind of empirical research on that, or are people headed in that direction? Can you
Yeah,
figure it out?
yeah. There has been a lot. So Samard, came up with this kind of let's call it a beautiful story of the mother tree. But yeah, she's a biologist. I mean, she's been studying this from the rhizomal, like the rhizome network, and also the um, uh, what's the yeah, the fungal networks that cause root networks to relate. So as a biologist, she's been studying this phenomenon. There have been studies done on chemical responses to predation in tree species that are communicated to other trees. There's lots of empirical work to sort of support this metaphor, if you will. So those
Jillian,
are, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Christian.
no, I was just going to say, if I can interest you in possibly giving you a chance to one nature documentary, you might find interesting. I don't remember exactly what it's called, but if you look up fungus on Netflix, there is some sort of, I think it's called Fantastic Fungi. They talk about these mycorrhizal fungal networks. And it's very visually stunning as well. But these fungal networks have a lot of background study on them for the interconnectedness of trees and non-tree species in forests, having a sense of community and relationship, self-sacrifice, protection for non-related species. Like one tree will transfer nutrients to a neighboring tree of another species to maintain its life support.
Yeah.
It mirrors loosely neurological brain systems. That's a metaphor scientists will sometimes use. So
Yep.
you might be interested in that, and that might give you that inspired feeling that we're talking about, that's spiritual and hard to argue if you see the visually stunning elements while also learning about the science at the same time.
And
I'm
then-
wondering if this is related, but there's more work being done on shrooms and psychedelic experiences. Is that related at all? Is that like a, I don't know, like a
It's not the
concrete
same
example
mushroom.
of a connection? Huh?
It's not the same mushroom. I mean, mycorrhizal fungi it's the connection between these threads of fungus that are like trillions and trillions of feet long and just interconnected. Those mushrooms, I think that the same person is attracted to both ideas.
But Jillian, I don't think you're far off. I mean, I think Gretchen's right. The same people are interested in exploring these ideas both internally, so psychedelically, but also externally, ecologically, and those are intention. Sable, thanks for being here. That's great. Yeah. So the last example, Jillian, I was going to give you to motivate this idea of spiritual connection is just to circle back onto that husbandry idea. Like if you've talked to a local farmer there in Indiana or anywhere, you'll be hard pressed to get them to admit that like what they're doing is purely scientific or purely instrumental. There's a care relationship that's built into any work, whether it's a soy and corn farmer or whether it's a cattle rancher. There's something else going on there, at least in my experience. And this is true. I grew up in a veterinary family, so it's true also, I think, in veterinary medicine. There are these like deep relationships that make things a lot more than instrumental.
So
Hey, and
I
how you doing?
guess if you take the environmental ethics argument that animals, like that there shouldn't be that interconnectedness and animals are here to serve humans and everything, would you say that it's more ethical to have those like terrible, big factories where they do like the machine killing and cut off the chicken heads, whatever, if it's like would it be unethical then to have a farm with animals that you feel spiritually connected to?
Well, yeah.
If you took the other side of
Yeah.
the environmental ethics
if you
issue.
were a strict instrumentalist, right?
Yeah.
Then yeah, you'd think you'd want to maximize production. Then yeah, the giant multi-story slaughterhouses and confinement agriculture make good instrumental sense. But then I don't think you'd have any recourse to explain something like what you're describing as a spiritual connection to local agriculture. You'd think those people are miswired, right? They're like you're doing something wrong, and that there can't possibly be that connection. That they're just like misappropriating. Josh, go ahead.
I was just say it does seem like that would be a mistake. That would be maybe like, oh, they're irrational in some way. But like, if you have a preference for some spiritual connection and you're a strict human first instrumentalist about animals, okay, that's fine. If Julian wants to have a connection to nature, so I feel like there's a way in which like the moral or normative concern might go, at least in this case, one direction. The ecologist or the person who has a wider scope of who matters more, at least, will have concerns for the instrumentalist, but the human first people. Yeah, you're weird. Maybe I don't want to hang out with you, but that's.
Yeah, it works the other way too. Yeah. So the manatee problem that we've been talking about, again, just to circle back around, I think it feels, I've heard the argument too often, so I assume it's a regular argument that it's an agricultural problem. And I think we've been trying to articulate all the ways that the manatee relationship is much more complex. And there are all these tensions, value tensions, and instrumental tensions, and social economic tensions too, that go into thinking through agricultural runoff and its causal or a causal relationship to manatees and manatee die-offs. You've got on the one side, let's call them the instrumentalists who are worried about the profit margins of tourism dollars. And the other side, you've got the Wendell Berrys and Aldo Leopolds, and the hippy dippy side, Jillian, on your account, of the folks who are like deeply concerned, the intrinsic valuists who are concerned about the manatees for their own sake and their ecological networks. And of course, I don't think there's anybody who's one or the other. Everybody is somewhere in the middle. And that's what makes this problem, like all problems in environmental ethics, so interesting, is that we're constantly arbitrating these value trade-offs and these value tensions. And part of that, Jillian, comes back as much as the history of philosophy doesn't want to admit it, to the role of intuitions and the role of emotions. That's the moral psychology critique, I think, generally speaking. But I think there's a lot of work to do. If we just stopped at intuition, the game would be up, right? There's a lot of work to do on the figuring out where those come from and why, the reasoning side. And so it's a both and. We've got a recommendation to watch a show called Fantastic Fungi on Networks, which I'm excited on Netflix, which I'm excited about. And we'll keep everything in the chat, and this recording will be up so you can review it if you want. But there's a million more things to say. We can keep the conversation going, but I'll say that our next session is in the same thread of agricultural and environmental ethics, but a little more on the regulatory side. I wanted a chance to think with the community about IACUCs, institutional animal care and use committees. There are regulatory practices and best practices and some intersection among those about what IACUCs are supposed to do at our institutions. And I want to talk those through with you all and get some feedback. So that'll be what we'll do on our next session. And then there are 2 more after that. So stay tuned and tell your friends and family and pets and whoever else might want to come in.
Tell your manatees.
Tell your local
Yeah.
manatees. That's right. All right.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. It was good to see you.
Thanks, Jillian.